let's dive right into this explainer and unpack one of the absolute most dramatic moments in modern British history. We're talking about a singular event that deeply echoes in labor disputes even today. It's a story that reveals the incredible, undeniable strengths, but also the sharp, painful limitations of organized labor in the early 20th century. We're looking at profound unity colliding head-on with the power of the state. Just 9 days. For exactly 9 days in May of 1926, the entire British economy ground to an absolute screeching halt. But in that tiny window of time, millions of workers dropped everything in a magnificent display of working-class unity. As we're going to see, though, those same 9 days served as a really painful lesson in the limits of what a strike actually achieve if you don't have the right preparation and strategy. So, how did this all start? Well, to make sense of it, we really have to look at the post-war coal crisis and a fundamentally struggling industry. British coal used to be this absolute industrial powerhouse, but by the 1920s, it was in serious trouble. Coal exports had plummeted, foreign competition was fierce, and honestly, a lot of the British mines were just old, inefficient, and wildly expensive to run. And the real kicker here is that entire communities in regions like South Wales, Yorkshire, Durham, Northumberland, and Scotland relied almost completely on coal wages. So, to make up for their falling profits, mine owners decided to drastically cut wages and actually increase working hours. Mining was already intensely dangerous, exhausting work, so for these communities, demands like that were just brutal. And the miners? Well, their response was a total hardline. Their rallying cry became, "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day." It's incredibly catchy, right? But more importantly, it perfectly captures their absolute, unwavering refusal to compromise. There was simply no way they were going to accept lower pay or longer, more exhausting hours down in those dangerous underground conditions. Which brings us to the actual countdown to the strike, stretching from what became known as Red Friday all the way to the massive lockout. See, back in 1925, miners were already threatening these massive wage cuts, but conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin stepped in. He actually granted a temporary government subsidy to maintain the miners' wages, successfully avoiding a strike that year. Trade unionists completely celebrated this. They called it Red Friday because, hey, it looked like a huge victory for organized labor. But actually, it really just gave the government crucial time to prepare its defenses for a showdown they knew was inevitable. The clock was officially ticking. Following Red Friday, Baldwin appointed the Samuel Commission, led by Sir Herbert Samuel, to investigate the whole industry. By March 1926, the report was in. It recommended reorganizing things, sure, but it also concluded that miners' wages would probably have to fall. And since that government subsidy was ending, mine owners immediately tried to impose those worst terms. When the miners refused, boom, over 1 million of them were literally locked out of the mines by the end of April. Tensions absolutely peaked, a special trade union conference voted for action, and it all culminated in a general strike starting at exactly 1 minute to midnight on May 3rd, 1926. And that kicks off 9 days of total disruption and an unprecedented display of solidarity. The sheer scale of this thing was absolutely staggering. We're talking between 1.5 and 1.75 million workers walking out immediately. And some later estimates say the ripple effect was even bigger. And we aren't just talking about miners anymore. Railway workers, transport workers, dockers, printers, builders, iron, steel, gas, and electricity workers all stepped up. They used their massive collective power to squeeze the government. Public transport slowed to a crawl or just stopped entirely, newspapers couldn't print, and the docks sat completely empty. Across major industrial hubs, I'm talking Glasgow, London, Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, Cardiff, and the South Wales valleys, key industries were just paralyzed. Strike committees popped up everywhere to organize local action. And this really proves that this wasn't just some localized economic dispute over a few shillings. This was a profound display of working-class solidarity. You had workers who had literally nothing to do with the coal mines, perfectly willing to lose their own paychecks just to defend the conditions of the miners. But, of course, the state fights back, and this becomes a fascinating study in preparation versus caution. The contrast in leadership styles here is so stark. On one hand, you have the Trades Union Congress, or TUC. Their leadership, including General Secretary Walter Citrine, was actually pretty cautious. They absolutely didn't want a revolution. They just wanted to apply controlled industrial pressure to help out the miners. But on the flip side, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's government completely framed the strike as a direct, constitutional threat to Parliament. And the government was way better prepared. They used emergency powers, mobilized the armed forces and the police, and even organized middle-class volunteers to keep essential services running and fiercely defend order. And you can see this resource gap perfectly in the media war. The TUC published a paper called The British Worker just to try and keep union morale up, but the government? They published their own daily newspaper, the British Gazette, and it was edited by none other than Winston Churchill. The state simply had massively superior resources and far stronger control over communication, which meant they could strictly dictate the national narrative to the public. The government really held the strategic upper hand. Just look at May 8th. They actually deployed the army to protect lorries carrying food from the London docks all the way to Hyde Park. Now, this wasn't just about logistics. It was a hugely powerful visual message to the public, proving that the state was still in charge and could keep basic supplies moving. By presenting itself as the capable defender of everyday order, the state ensured this never tipped over into a violent national uprising. And to their credit, organized labor remained highly disciplined. They were very reluctant to escalate things beyond that controlled pressure. Which, unfortunately, leads us to the sudden collapse, the bitter aftermath, and how the strike finally ends. So, on May 12, 1926, after just 9 days, the TUC suddenly called off the strike. And the real shocker? They did it without securing any guaranteed victory for the miners' demands. This completely exposed the central limitation of the entire movement. The TUC proved they could totally disrupt Britain, sure, but they absolutely could not force the government or the mine owners to actually surrender. The fallout from this was pretty tragic. In May, the miners felt totally betrayed. They had inspired this massive nationwide strike, only to be suddenly left entirely isolated to fight alone. And they did. Throughout the long summer of 1926, they bravely stayed out on strike. But severe hunger and poverty gradually spread through the coalfield communities. By late November, the economic desperation finally broke the standoff, forcing most miners back to work. In the end, they had to swallow lower wages, longer hours, and isolated district agreements, losing the national protection they had fought so incredibly hard for. So, what's the legacy of all this? Let's look at the limits of that solidarity and the 1927 Act. The state learned its lesson super quickly. The conservative government swept in and passed the 1927 Trade Disputes and Trade Unions Act to ensure nothing like 1926 could ever happen again. They banned general strikes entirely, they banned sympathy strikes entirely, they strictly limited mass picketing, and even changed the rules around how trade unions could fund political parties. This effectively and permanently crippled organized labor's ability to act collectively and apply wide-scale pressure like that again. The 1926 general strike was, without a doubt, a magnificent display of working-class unity. Millions of people acted together across industries and regions, proving just how essential they were to the nation's functioning. But it leaves us with this really provocative question. Is solidarity ever enough without a strategy? Because as we've seen throughout this explainer, the strike proved that without deep preparation, immense resources, relentless leadership, and a clear plan for outlasting the government, solidarity alone has very real, very painful limits. It's a heavy lesson from 1926, and one that anyone looking at labor movements today absolutely still has to grapple with.